The Madness of King George. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle as King George III paced the length of his private chamber. It was 1788, and the king had ruled Britain for 28 years. Years that had seen the loss of the American colonies, the expansion of empire in India, and the growth of his own family to 15 children. But on this particular November morning, something felt desperately wrong inside his royal head. "The walls are speaking," he muttered to himself, pressing his palms against the cool stone. "Can you hear them? They whisper of treason." His equerry, Colonel Robert Fulk Greville, stood by the doorway with growing concern etched across his weathered face. The king had been acting peculiarly for several weeks now, talking incessantly, racing from subject to subject without pause, his eyes bright with an unsettling fever that seemed to burn from within. "Your Majesty," Greville ventured carefully, "the physicians are waiting to examine you. Dr. Warren and Dr. Baker have travelled from London at the Queen's request." George whirled around, his powdered wig slightly askew. At 50 years old, he remained an imposing figure, despite his moderate height, but today his usual dignified bearing had given way to erratic movement and gestures. "Physicians? I need no physicians. I am perfectly well. Better than well. I have never felt more alive, more aware of the intricacies of governance, and the delicate balance of power that keeps this realm from descending into chaos." Words tumbled out in a torrent, barely allowing space for breath between them. This was not the measured, thoughtful monarch that Greville had served for years. This was someone, or something, else entirely. Queen Charlotte waited in her apartments, wringing her hands nervously while her daughters clustered around her. The princesses, Charlotte, Augusta, Elizabeth, Mary, Sophia, and Amelia, ranged in age from 22 down to 5 years old, and even the youngest could sense that something had gone terribly wrong with their beloved papa. "He spoke to me for 5 hours yesterday," the Queen confided to Lady Pembroke, her lady-in-waiting. 5 hours without stopping, jumping from the state of agriculture in Berkshire to the proper education of young ladies to his opinions on Handel's oratorios. His voice grew hoarse, but he could not stop. And his eyes. Oh, his eyes looked through me as though I were made of glass. The physicians, when they finally gained access to the king, found him in a state of high agitation. Dr. Richard Warren, physician in ordinary to the royal household, attempted to take his Majesty's pulse, only to have the king seize his wrist instead. "Your pulse is racing, Dr. Warren," George declared with inappropriate glee. "Are you quite well? Perhaps you should be the patient, and I the physician. I have made quite a study of medical matters, you know. The circulation of the blood, the humours, the application of leeches, fascinating subjects all. Dr. Francis Willis would arrive within the week, summoned from his private asylum in Lincolnshire. Willis was a clergyman who had turned to treating mental disorders with what he claimed were modern, enlightened methods. He was 69 years old, and carried himself with the authority of both spiritual and medical calling. The Queen had heard he achieved remarkable results with disturbed patients, though his methods were whispered to be quite severe. But before Willis could make his appearance, the king's condition deteriorated further. At a concert in the castle's music room, George suddenly leapt from his seat and embraced one of the violinists, declaring him to be his long-lost son. When the Prince of Wales, the actual eldest son, attempted to intervene, the king pushed him away roughly. "You are not my son," he shouted at the prince. "You conspire with your mother and the ministers to have me declared unfit. I see it all now, the plots, the whispers, the secret meetings." The Prince of Wales, 26 years old and already at odds with his father over debts and lifestyle, stepped back in shock. For all their disagreements, he had never seen his father in such a state. The king's face had turned an alarming shade of purple, and spittle flew from his lips as he ranted about conspiracies that existed only in his fevered imagination. That night, the king's urine turned blue. The servants who discovered this phenomenon were terrified, certain they were witnessing some form of witchcraft or divine punishment. The discoloration was so vivid, so unnatural, that rumors spread rapidly through the castle's corridors. Dr. Warren examined the chamber pot with bewilderment, having never encountered such a thing in 40 years of medical practice. "It is a sign," one of the chambermaids whispered to another. "The king has been cursed." When Dr. Willis finally arrived at Windsor, he swept into the sick room with the confidence of a general taking command of a battlefield. He was tall and imposing, with iron-grey hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to bore into the souls of those he examined. He believed that madness could be controlled through the assertion of will, his will over that of the patient. "Your Majesty," Willis said, bowing but maintaining steady eye contact, "I am here to restore your reason." The king, who had been relatively calm for the previous hour, bristled at the implication. "My reason requires no restoration. It is as sharp as it has ever been. I can recite the lineages of every crowned head in Europe, calculate the revenues of the kingdom down to the last shilling, and debate points of theology with any bishop in the realm." Willis listened impassively, then gestured to his assistants, his sons, who had joined him in the treatment of mental disorders. "We shall see. Your Majesty will submit to a regimen designed to restore the proper balance of your faculties." What followed was a period of treatment that would later be viewed with horror by more enlightened medical minds. The king was confined to a chair, strapped down when his agitation grew too severe. He was subjected to blistering, the application of hot materials to the skin to draw out supposed toxins. His head was shaved in places and covered with plasters. He was given emetics to induce vomiting and purgatives to cleanse his bowels, weakening his body in the belief that this would somehow strengthen his mind. Through it all, Willis maintained his stern, unyielding demeanor. When the king ranted, Willis would stare him down until the monarch fell silent. When George tried to maintain his royal dignity and command that the treatment stop, Willis would remind him that he was a patient now, not a king, and must submit to medical authority. "I am still your sovereign," George would insist, his voice breaking with desperation and rage. "You are a man who is unwell," Willis would reply calmly, "and until you are well again, you must trust in those who can see clearly what you cannot." The kingdom held its breath. Parliament debated the necessity of a regency bill that would transfer power to the Prince of Wales should the king's madness prove permanent. William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister and loyal to the king, fought desperately to delay any such transfer, knowing that the prince and his Whig allies would immediately dismiss him from office. In the castle, Queen Charlotte maintained a vigil that would last for months. She visited her husband daily, though Willis carefully controlled these interactions. Sometimes George recognized her. Other times he called her by the name of his childhood governess, or claimed she was an impostor. On his better days, he would weep and apologize for the pain he was causing her and their children. "My dear Charlotte," he would say, grasping her hand with desperate intensity, "if I recover my senses, will you forgive me for this madness? Will our children remember me as I was, and not as I am now?" "Of course, my dear," she would whisper, though tears streamed down her face. "We await only your return to us." The winter of 1788 through 1789 was the darkest period of George's life and reign. There were days when he seemed to improve, speaking rationally and showing interest in affairs of state. Then, without warning, the madness would return like a violent storm, and he would descend again into ranting, paranoia, and bizarre behaviour that mortified his attendants and broke his family's hearts. By February of 1789, something remarkable began to happen. The fits of madness grew less frequent. The king's speech, while still rapid at times, regained some of its former coherence. He began to recognize people consistently, and showed genuine interest in the books and newspapers brought to him. Dr. Willis, who had never doubted his methods, proclaimed it a triumph of will and proper treatment. The truth, which would not be understood for more than 2 centuries, was far different. King George III suffered from porphyria, a metabolic disorder that caused the buildup of toxic substances in his body. These substances affected his nervous system, producing the symptoms that everyone attributed to madness. The blue urine, the abdominal pain he often mentioned, the sensitivity to light, all were hallmarks of this disease, and like many periodic illnesses, it came and went according to patterns that had nothing to do with Willis's treatments. But in 1789, no one knew of porphyria. What mattered was that the king was recovering, that the crisis was passing, and that the realm could breathe easily once more. On the 10th of March, a service of thanksgiving was held at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The king, still weak and thin from his ordeal, rode in procession through streets lined with cheering crowds. People wept with joy to see their monarch restored, and church bells rang throughout the city. George himself was overcome with emotion, grateful to have returned from the dark place where his mind had wandered. "I have been to the edge of an abyss," he confided to Pitt during a private meeting shortly after his recovery. "I have looked into madness and felt it looking back at me. If it comes again, and I fear it might, promise me that my family and my kingdom will be protected." Pitt, moved by the king's vulnerability, assured him that all would be well, but both men knew the truth. The illness could return at any time, and when it did, there would be no guarantees. For the next decade, King George lived under a shadow. He was careful, perhaps too careful, about his health and mental state. He avoided excessive stress, maintained regular habits, and watched himself constantly for any sign that the madness might be returning. His family learned to recognize the early warning signs: the rapid speech, the sleeplessness, the grandiose ideas that seemed to come from nowhere. Small episodes occurred in 1801, brief enough that they could be kept relatively private. The king would retreat to Windsor or Kew Palace, his physicians would be summoned, and within weeks he would emerge, shaken but recovered. The public knew something of these lapses, but the full extent was carefully managed. The mad king was dangerous not just to himself, but to the stability of the realm. George's relationship with his eldest son never fully recovered from the crisis of 1788. The Prince of Wales had come too close to power, had tasted the anticipation of ruling in his father's place. When the king recovered, a barrier remained between them, unspoken resentment on the prince's side and on the king's, a hurt that his own son had seemed almost eager to replace him. The younger children, however, remained devoted to their father. Princess Amelia, the youngest and his favourite, became particularly close to him. She would read to him, play music for him, and accompany him on his walks through the grounds of Windsor. In her company, the king found peace and genuine happiness that eluded him elsewhere. "You are my treasure," he would tell her, "my consolation in troubled times." Years passed. Britain fought Napoleon, expanded its empire, and underwent the early stages of industrialization. Through it all, George tried to be the king his people needed, dutiful, moral, devoted to his duties. But the illness was patient, and it was waiting. In 18010, the death of Princess Amelia at the age of 27 shattered the king's fragile equilibrium. She had been ill for more than a year with tuberculosis, wasting away despite all efforts to save her. George sat at her bedside during her final days, holding her hand and refusing to believe that she would not recover. "You cannot leave me," he whispered to her. "You are too young, too full of life. This cannot be happening." But it was happening, and when Amelia died on the 2nd of November, something broke inside the king that would never be repaired. The grief combined with what was likely another attack of porphyria, and George descended into a madness from which he would never fully emerge. This time, there was no Dr. Willis to impose his will and declare victory. Willis had died years earlier, and his methods had fallen out of favour. Instead, the king was simply kept comfortable and confined. He was moved to apartments at Windsor, where he could be cared for without constantly being in the public eye. Prince of Wales was finally appointed Prince Regent in 1811, assuming the powers of the monarchy while his father lived on in twilight. George III, who had once ruled the greatest empire on earth, spent his final years in a world increasingly disconnected from reality. He would have periods of lucidity, moments when he recognized his attendants and asked about his family, but these moments grew rarer as time went on. He went blind from cataracts, though he claimed he could still see angels visiting him. He went deaf, though he insisted he could hear music that no one else perceived. His hair and beard grew long and white, giving him the appearance of a biblical prophet wandering lost in time. Sometimes he believed he was still the young king who had taken the throne in 1760 at the age of 22, full of idealism and determination to be a good monarch. He would ask for his late ministers, men who had been dead for decades. He would speak of the American colonies as though they were still part of his realm, and wonder aloud why his son George was not visiting him more often, not realizing he was referring to his eldest son, long since middle-aged and serving as regent. Other times he seemed to exist outside of time altogether, conversing with people no one else could see and discussing events that had never happened. His attendants learned to simply agree with whatever he said, finding that contradiction only agitated him. His Majesty is happy in his own world, one of his physicians noted in 1818. He suffers no distress in his delusions. Perhaps this is a mercy. that his mind has found a peaceful place to rest while his body continues its slow decline. Queen Charlotte died in 1817, never having fully recovered from the strain of managing her husband's illness while watching their son rule in his place. George was told of her death, but it is unclear if he understood. He asked for her several times in the following days, then seemed to forget about her entirely. The old king lingered for 3 more years, his body robust, despite the ruin of his mind. He was 78 years old, and had reigned for 59 years, longer than any British monarch before him. His subjects, most of whom had known no other king, waited with a mixture of respect and impatience for the inevitable end. On the 29th of January, 1820, at 8:30 in the evening, King George III died at Windsor Castle. The long twilight was finally over. His son, who had been Prince Regent for nearly a decade, succeeded him as King George IV. The nation mourned, but it was a complicated grief. They mourned for the young king who had tried so hard to be good, who had loved his family and his duties. They mourned for the tragedy of a brilliant mind lost to illness that no one understood. But they were also relieved that the long, painful coda to his reign had finally concluded, and that perhaps now they could move forward into a new era. History would be kinder to George III than his contemporaries sometimes were. His madness, terrible as it was, could not erase the achievements of his long reign, or the genuine decency that had characterized most of his life. He had lost America, but kept his integrity. He had lost his mind, but never his family's love. He had been a man trapped by illness and duty, trying desperately to be the king his nation needed, even when his own body and brain betrayed him. In the end, the madness of King George was not simply the story of a monarch's mental illness. It was the story of how fragile human consciousness could be, how disease showed no respect for crown or title, and how dignity could persist even in the face of devastating loss. It was a reminder that kings were, after all, merely human, subject to the same sufferings and vulnerabilities as the humblest of their subjects, just played out on a much more public stage. The blue urine, the ranting, the confusion, all would eventually be explained by medical science that the 18th century could not have imagined. But the courage of a man trying to maintain his reason while it slipped away, and the devotion of a family watching helplessly as someone they loved disappeared into illness. These needed no scientific explanation. They were simply the eternal human story of love, loss, and the cruel mysteries of the mind. The final night of King Harold II. The wind howled across the ridge at Senlac Hill, like the breath of some ancient god, carrying with it the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smoke of 1,000 dying fires. King Harold II of England stood alone in his command tent, the canvas walls snapping and billowing around him, like the sails of a ship caught in a storm. Outside, the sounds of his army preparing for sleep mingled with the groans of the wounded, creating a symphony of suffering that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. It was the 13th day of October in the year 1066, though to Harold it felt as if he had lived a dozen lifetimes in the span of 3 weeks. His reflection in the polished bronze mirror showed a man aged beyond his 44 years, his face carved with lines of exhaustion and worry, his once bright eyes now dulled by the weight of impossible choices. The crown of England sat heavy on his brow. though he had removed it hours ago and placed it on the small wooden table beside his sleeping pallet. In the flickering candlelight, it seemed less a symbol of power and more a golden shackle. He poured himself a cup of wine from the pitcher his squire had left, noting how his hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, he told himself, but from the bone-deep weariness that came from fighting 2 major battles in the span of less than a month. First, there had been Stamford Bridge up in the north, where he had crushed the invasion of Harold Hardrada of Norway and his own treacherous brother Tostig. That victory should have been celebrated throughout the kingdom, sung about in mead halls for generations. Instead, Harold had barely allowed his men a single night's rest before force-marching them 240 miles south to face a new invader, William of Normandy. The Norman Duke had landed on the 28th of September, setting up camp at Pevensey, and then moving to Hastings, burning and pillaging the lands of Sussex as if he already owned them. Harold had arrived on Senlac Hill just that morning, the 14th of October, his army exhausted, depleted, and stretched to breaking point. Yet they had fought with the courage of lions, forming the legendary shield wall that had held against wave after wave of Norman cavalry and arrows. Harold walked to the entrance of his tent and pulled back the flap, looking out over the encampment. Thousands of cook fires dotted the hillside, each one surrounded by clusters of men trying to warm themselves against the October chill. These were his men, his people, farmers and thanes, housecarls and firds, men who had left their fields and families to answer their king's call. Many of them had marched with him from the north, their feet bloodied and blistered, their bodies pushed beyond human endurance. How could he ask them to do the impossible once more when the sun rose tomorrow? A figure approached through the darkness, and Harold recognized the gait of his brother Gurth, Earl of East Anglia. At 34 years old, Gurth was 10 years Harold's junior, with the same broad shoulders and strong jaw that marked the Godwinson line. Unlike Harold, however, Gurth's face still held some of the optimism of youth, though it was fading fast with each passing hour. "Brother," Gurth said, his voice low, "you should be resting. Tomorrow will be the hardest day of our lives." Harold managed a bitter smile. "Tomorrow will be the hardest day, or it will be the last day. I find I cannot sleep knowing which it might be." Gurth stepped into the tent, and Harold noticed he was not alone. Their youngest brother, Leofwine, Earl of Kent, followed behind. At about 32 years of age, Leofwine had always been the most cheerful of the 3 surviving Godwinson brothers, quick with the joke and quicker with the sword. Tonight, however, his usual smile was nowhere to be seen. "We need to talk, Harold," Leofwine said, and there was an urgency in his voice that made Harold's stomach tighten. "About tomorrow's battle. About our strategy." Harold gestured for them to sit, and the 3 brothers settled onto the campaign stools arranged around the small table. Harold poured wine for each of them, and for a moment they simply sat in silence. 3 men who had grown up together, fought together, and now faced death together. "Speak plainly," Harold said. "What troubles you?" Gurth leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Our position troubles me, Harold. We hold the high ground, yes, and our shield wall proved its worth today. But we are too few. We lost good men at Stamford Bridge, and we have had no time to gather reinforcements. William has fresh troops, rested horses, and the patience to wait us out." "We cannot wait," Harold said firmly. "Every day we remain here, William ravages more of my kingdom. Every village he burns, every field he destroys, weakens England. I will not allow that Norman bastard to carve up my lands while I sit on a hill and watch." "Then let us take a different approach," Leofwine interjected. "Fall back, retreat to London, gather every able-bodied man in the kingdom, return with an army so large that William will have no choice but to board his ships and flee back to Normandy." Harold shook his head. The suggestion was not without merit. And in the meantime, William consolidates his position. He builds fortifications. He brings more men from across the Channel. No, we must strike now, while he is still vulnerable. One decisive victory, and the Norman threat ends. Or one decisive defeat, and England falls, Gurth said quietly. "Brother, I beg you, think of the kingdom. Think of your sons. If you fall tomorrow, who leads England? Your boys are too young, too inexperienced. The kingdom will tear itself apart." Harold felt anger flash through him, hot and sudden. "You think I do not know this? You think I have not lain awake every night since I took this cursed crown, knowing that every decision I make could doom the kingdom I swore to protect?" He took a breath, forcing himself to calm. "But I am the king. I am the anointed sovereign of England. If I run now, if I show weakness, every petty lord and ambitious earl will see it. The kingdom will not rally to a coward, it will devour one." The tent fell silent again, save for the distant sounds of the camp and the ever-present wind. Finally, Gurth spoke again, and his voice was gentle. "No one would call you a coward, Harold. You have proven your courage 100 times over. You defeated the greatest Viking warrior of our age just 3 weeks ago. You have nothing left to prove." "Nothing except that I can keep my kingdom," Harold replied. He stood and walked back to the tent entrance, looking out at the fires again. "Do you know what I fear most? Not death, not defeat. I fear that in 100 years, in 1,000 years, people will look back at this moment and say that Harold Godwin's, the last true English king, threw away his kingdom because he was too proud or too stubborn to retreat. I fear being remembered as the man who lost England." Leofwine came to stand beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then let us make sure that does not happen. Whether we fight tomorrow or whether we retreat, we face it together. 3 of us, as we always have." Harold turned to look at his younger brother, seeing the love and loyalty there, and felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You should both leave," he said suddenly. "Tonight, take horses and ride for London. Live to fight another day. If tomorrow goes badly, England will need you." "Absolutely not," Gurth said, standing up so quickly his stool toppled over. "We are Godwinsons. We stand together, or we fall together. There is no other way." "He is right," Leofwine added. "Besides, who would protect your thick head if we were not there to guard your flanks?" Despite everything, Harold smiled. "You are both fools." "We learned from the best," Gurth said with a slight grin. The commotion outside the tent drew their attention. Harold heard raised voices, and then his chamberlain appeared at the entrance, looking flustered. "My lord king, forgive the interruption, but there is a messenger from the Norman camp. He says Duke William wishes to parley." Harold exchanged glances with his brothers. "At this hour? What game is William playing?" Perhaps he seeks terms of surrender, Leofwine suggested hopefully. Or perhaps he seeks to spy on our defences, Gurth countered. Harold made his decision quickly. Bring him in under guard and search him thoroughly for weapons. A few minutes later, a Norman knight was escorted into the tent by 4 of Harold's housecarls, their axes held ready. The knight was young, perhaps 25 years old, with the bearing of minor nobility. He bowed stiffly to Harold. "My Lord King," he said in accented English, "I bring greetings from William, Duke of Normandy, rightful King of England." Harold felt his jaw clench at the title, but he kept his voice level. "Duke William has no right to the English crown. It was given to me by King Edward on his deathbed, and confirmed by the Lieutenant. Whatever message you bring, deliver it quickly." The knight's composure wavered slightly under Harold's hard stare, but he pressed on. "My Lord Duke wishes you to know that he takes no pleasure in the bloodshed that occurred today. He proposes a solution that would prevent further loss of life on both sides." "I am listening," Harold said, though he could already guess what was coming. "Duke William asks that you acknowledge his rightful claim to the throne of England. In return, he would grant you the earldom of Wessex to hold as his vassal. Your brothers would retain their lands as well. All he asks is your oath of fealty and the crown that rightfully belongs to him." The tent erupted. Gurth started forward, his hand on his sword, while Leofwine let out a stream of curses that would have made a sailor blush. Harold held up a hand, and his brothers reluctantly fell silent, though their fury was palpable. Harold studied the young knight carefully, seeing the nervousness behind his brave facade. "Tell me, what is your name?" "I am Robert Fitzwimmark, my lord, vassal of Duke William." "Well then, Robert Fitzwimmark, I will give you an answer to carry back to your duke. Are you prepared to remember my words exactly?" "I am, my lord." Harold drew himself up to his full height, and in that moment he looked every inch the warrior king. "Tell William of Normandy that Harold, by the grace of God, King of England, rejects his offer with a contempt it deserves. Tell him that Edward the Confessor granted me this crown on his deathbed, as was his right as the anointed king. Tell him that the nobles and bishops of England confirmed my kingship, as was their right as according to English law. Tell him that any oath I may have sworn to him years ago was given under duress when I was his prisoner, and such oaths are void in the eyes of God and man." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And tell him this, Robert Fitzwimmark, tomorrow when the sun rises, we will settle this matter the only way it can be settled, by the sword and the will of God. If William wants the crown of England, he can pry it from my cold, dead hands." The Norman knight had gone pale, but he nodded. "I will deliver your message, my lord." "One more thing," Harold added, his voice softening slightly. "Tell your duke that I respect his courage in crossing the channel with his army. Tell him that in another world, another time, we might have been friends rather than enemies. But tell him also that I will defend my kingdom with every breath in my body, and that the men who stand with me are the bravest in the world. If he seeks glory through conquest, he will find it tomorrow, but he may also find his death." Robert bowed again and was escorted from the tent. As soon as he was gone, Leofwine let out a long breath. "Well, that tears it. No turning back now." "There is never any turning back," Harold said quietly. He returned to his stool and sat heavily, suddenly feeling every one of his 44 years. William would never have let me keep Wessex. The moment I bent the knee, I would have become a puppet, and eventually he would have found some excuse to remove me. Better to die a king than live as a slave. Girth poured himself more wine and drank deeply. Then let us talk strategy for tomorrow. William will not make the same mistakes twice. Today he threw his cavalry at our shield wall, and it broke against us like waves on a cliff. Tomorrow he will be more cunning. He will use his archers more effectively, Leofwine predicted. Today they shot too high, and their arrows passed over our shield wall. Tomorrow they will aim lower, try to hit our legs, and break our formation. Harold nodded. We need to reinforce the flanks. That is where our line is weakest, and we need to maintain discipline. Today, some of our men broke formation to chase retreating Normans and were cut down. Tomorrow, no one leaves the shield wall without my direct order. They talked long into the night, planning positions and contingencies, discussing which commanders should be placed where, which units were still fresh enough to hold critical positions. It was past midnight when Girth and Leofwine finally left to check on their own men and get a few hours of sleep. Harold remained in his tent, knowing that sleep would not come for him. Instead, he pulled out a piece of parchment and a quill, intending to write letters to his sons in case tomorrow went badly. But as he sat there, staring at the blank page, he found he could not find the words. What did you say to children who might never see their father again? How did you comfort them when you were about to gamble their entire future on a single day's battle? He thought of his eldest son, Godwin, barely 18 years old and eager to prove himself. Harold had sent him to the West Country to raise more troops, a task that would keep him safe from tomorrow's battle, but would also fill him with guilt if his father fell. His other sons were even younger, boys who should be learning to hunt and hawk, not preparing to defend a kingdom against Norman invaders. And then there was Edith Swanneck, his handfast wife of more than 20 years, the mother of his children, the woman who knew him better than anyone. He had sent her away to safety weeks ago, and she had gone reluctantly, making him promise to come back to her. It was a promise he might not be able to keep. A noise outside his tent made him look up. He reached for his sword, but then he heard a familiar voice asking permission to enter. "Come," Harold called, and his most trusted advisor, Ansgar the Staller, ducked into the tent. Ansgar was an old warrior, well past 60 years of age, with more scars than hairs on his head. He had served Harold's father, Earl Godwin, and had been a steady presence at Harold's side for decades. Now, he looked at his king with concern. "You should sleep, my lord. You will need your strength tomorrow." "I will sleep when this is over," Harold replied, "one way or another." Ansgar sat down uninvited, which was one of the privileges of long friendship. "I was at the north end of the line today. I saw the fighting there. Our men held like champions." "They did," Harold agreed. "But will they hold tomorrow? And the day after that, if it comes to it? We cannot sustain a prolonged battle, Ansgar. William can afford to be patient. We cannot." "Then we break him tomorrow," Ansgar said simply. "We hold the shield wall until his men are exhausted, and then we push forward and drive them into the sea. It can be done. I have seen you do the impossible before." Harold smiled sadly. "Have I? Sometimes I wonder if everything I have achieved has just been luck and timing. Good men following a mediocre king because there was no better option." Ansgar's response was swift and sharp. That is exhaustion talking, and I will not hear it. You are the finest warrior and the wisest leader I have ever known. Your father would be proud of the man you have become, and the king you are." He leaned forward, his old eyes fierce. "Tomorrow, when you stand before that shield wall and address the men, they need to see strength. They need to see certainty. Can you give them that?" Harold met his old friend's gaze and found his resolve hardening. Yes, I can give them that." "Good." Ansgar stood to leave, but paused at the tent entrance. "My lord, I have served 3 kings in my life. Edward was holy but weak. Your father was strong but too ambitious. You're the balance between them. The king England needs. Whatever happens tomorrow, you have been worthy of the crown. Never doubt that." After Ansgar left, Harold finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what was coming. Tomorrow would indeed be the hardest day, the day that would determine not just his fate, but the fate of his entire people. The English had been invaded before by Romans and Vikings and Danes, but always they had endured, absorbing the conquerors and emerging stronger. But the Normans were different. If William won tomorrow, he would not integrate into English society. He would replace it, bringing his own language, his own laws, his own ways. The England that Harold knew and loved would cease to exist. He thought about the country he had sworn to protect. He thought about the villages and farms, the monasteries and churches, the ancient forests and rolling hills. He thought about the people, hard-working and proud, who had chosen him to lead them. They deserved better than this, better than a king who had led them into a battle they might not win. But there was no time for regret now. There was only tomorrow, and the slim hope that courage and determination might overcome superior numbers and fresh troops. Harold finally laid down on his pallet, not bothering to remove his armor. He stared up at the canvas ceiling of his tent, watching shadows dance in the candlelight. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and he wondered if it was an omen. In Norse mythology, wolves were creatures of destruction and endings. Perhaps it was fitting. His hand moved to touch the small wooden cross that hung around his neck, a gift from his mother many years ago. He whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for courage, for himself and his brothers, for his men who would stand with him tomorrow, for the kingdom he loved more than his own life. As the candle burned lower, Harold's thoughts drifted to the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, Edward the Confessor had still been alive, and Harold had been the most powerful earl in England, but still just a subject. Then Edward had died, leaving no direct heir, and the Wetan had chosen Harold to succeed him. It had been the greatest honour of his life, and perhaps the greatest curse. He thought about William of Normandy, waiting in his own tent, perhaps a mile away. The Norman Duke was younger than Harold, only 39 years old, but he had been hardened by a lifetime of warfare. William had fought his own vassals, neighbouring lords, and even the King of France. He was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly convinced of his divine right to the English throne. In William's mind, Harold was nothing but an oath-breaker and a usurper, a jumped-up earl who had stolen what rightfully belonged to Normandy. The truth was more complicated, as truth always was. Harold had indeed sworn an oath to William years ago, when he had been shipwrecked on the Norman coast and taken into William's custody. But that oath had been given under duress, extracted by a man who held Harold's life in his hands. More importantly, it had been superseded by Edward's deathbed designation and the Witan's confirmation. English law was clear. The crown could not be promised away to foreigners without the consent of the kingdom's nobles. William's claim was built on sand, but William did not care about English law or English customs. He had the backing of the Pope, who had sent him a consecrated banner to carry into battle. He had the support of adventurers and mercenaries from across Europe, drawn by promises of English land and wealth, and he had a burning ambition that would not be satisfied with anything less than total victory. Harold's eyes grew heavy despite his racing thoughts. He could not afford to sleep deeply, not with battle coming at dawn, but perhaps he could rest for an hour or two. He let his eyes close, the sounds of the camp fading into a distant murmur. In his dreams, he was young again, fighting alongside his father against the tyranny of Earl Godwin's enemies. He was at Stamford Bridge, watching Harold Hardrada fall, and knowing that the Viking age was finally over. He was in Westminster Abbey, feeling the crown placed upon his head, and the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. And then he was here, on Senlac Hill, watching the sun rise on the 15th of October in the year 1066, the final day of King Harold II of England, the forgotten Ice King of the North. In the far reaches of the world, where the auroras painted the sky in ribbons of emerald and violet, there existed a kingdom that time itself seemed reluctant to remember. The land stretched across frozen tundras and mountains of crystalline ice that caught the weak sunlight and scattered it into 1,000 dancing prisms. This was the domain of Iscaran the Pale, a ruler whose name had been whispered in awe and terror for generations, though now those whispers had faded into the howling winds that swept across his desolate realm. Iscaran had not always been forgotten. Once, his kingdom of Norvengard had been a jewel among the northern territories, a place where artisans crafted sculptures from ice that never melted, and where merchants travelled from distant lands to trade in furs so white they seemed spun from clouds. The capital city, Crystal Haven, had risen from the permafrost like a crown of frozen stars, its spires reaching toward the heavens as if in defiance of the harsh climate that sought to crush all life beneath its weight. In those days, Iscaran had been called the Just, the Wise, the guardian of the eternal winter. His people had loved him, for he had brought prosperity to a land where survival itself was an achievement worthy of celebration. But that was before the curse, before the long silence, before the world turned its back on the Ice King and his frozen domain. Now, 3 centuries after his disappearance from the annals of history, Iscaran sat alone in his throne room, a vast chamber carved from a single glacier that had stood for millennia. The throne itself was a masterwork of nature and magic combined, formed from ice that blazed with an inner light, neither warm nor cold, but something in between, something that existed outside the normal laws of temperature and time. The Ice King's appearance reflected the centuries of isolation that had consumed him. His hair, once golden like the brief summer sun that graced these lands, had turned to pure white, flowing past his shoulders in waves that seemed to move with a wind that wasn't there. His skin had taken on the translucent quality of ancient ice, pale blue veins visible beneath the surface, like rivers frozen in time. His eyes, however, remained unchanged, a deep blue that held the colour of the deepest ocean, still sharp and aware despite the weight of 300 years of solitude. He wore robes of white fur and silver thread, garments that had not aged because nothing in his kingdom aged anymore, suspended as it was in a moment that refused to end. Iskerin rose from his throne, his movements fluid despite the ages he had sat there. He walked to one of the great windows that lined the throne room, each pane made from ice so clear it might have been glass, had glass been able to withstand the bitter cold that was the natural state of Norvengard. Beyond the window stretched his kingdom, a landscape of haunting beauty and terrible emptiness. The city of Crystal Haven spread below him, its buildings intact, its streets unmarked by the passage of time, but utterly devoid of life. No smoke rose from chimneys, no voices carried on the wind. The marketplace where thousands had once bartered and laughed now stood silent, stalls still arranged as they had been on that day. 3 centuries passed when everything had changed. The Ice King pressed one pale hand against the window, and frost bloomed from his fingertips in intricate patterns that resembled nothing so much as memories given form. He could see them there in the frost. His wife, Alara, her dark hair a stark contrast to the whiteness of their world, her laughter bright enough to warm even the coldest winter day. Their daughter, Freya, barely 10 winters old when the curse had fallen, her small hands always cold despite the furs they wrapped her in, her smile capable of melting his heart in ways the endless winter never could. His advisors, his guards, his subjects, all of them preserved in these frost memories, forever young, forever lost. The curse had come without warning, as such things often do. Iskerin had been a just ruler, perhaps too just for the liking of some. He had refused the demands of the witch lords of the eastern wastes, a cabal of sorcerers who had sought to use Norvengard as a staging ground for their conquest of the southern kingdoms. When they came with their armies of ice wraiths and frost giants, Iskerin had stood against them with his own magic, for the rulers of Norvengard had always possessed a connection to the winter, an ability to call upon the cold itself as both weapon and shield. The battle had raged for 7 days and 7 nights, the sky itself torn apart by competing magics. Iskerin had proven stronger than the witch lords anticipated. One by one, he had shattered their armies, breaking the ice wraiths back into the formless cold from which they came, sending the frost giants fleeing back to their mountain caves. On the 7th day, as victory seemed certain, the witch lords had played their final desperate card. They had combined their remaining power into a single curse, not of destruction, but of isolation, not meant to kill, but to remove Norvengard from the world entirely. The curse had struck like a wave of invisible force, washing over the kingdom in an instant. Iskerin had felt it the moment it took hold, a sensation like being encased in amber, like being caught between one heartbeat and the next. Every living thing in Norvengard had been frozen, not in ice, but in time itself. His people had simply stopped, caught mid-step, mid-word, mid-breath. Children remained suspended in the act of throwing snowballs. Merchants held coins that would never complete their journey from hand to hand. His wife and daughter, who had been standing beside him on the palace balcony, became as still as statues carved from flesh. But Iskerin himself had been spared this fate, and that had been the cruelest part of the curse. As the ruler, as the one who wielded the magic of winter, he remained conscious, aware, alive in a way his subjects were not. He could move, could think, could feel, and feeling was the torture of it. The witch lords had ensured he would remain awake to witness his failure, to spend eternity among his frozen people, unable to break the curse, unable to save them, unable even to join them in their timeless sleep. The first century had been the hardest. Iscaran had tried everything within his considerable power to break the curse. He had pored over every scroll in the royal library, had attempted counterspells and rituals that drained him to the point of collapse. He had climbed to the highest peak of the Frostspire Mountains and called out to the ancient spirits of winter, begging for their aid. He had descended into the deepest ice caves where the old magic was said to dwell, offering himself as a sacrifice if only his people could be freed. Nothing had worked. The curse was too powerful, too perfectly crafted. It was woven from the combined might of 7 witch lords, and it would require something equally powerful to undo it. The 2nd century had brought resignation. Iscaran had continued his studies, but with less urgency, knowing in his heart that he had exhausted every possibility. He had walked among his frozen subjects, speaking to them as if they could hear, telling them stories of what the world beyond their kingdom must be like now. He had maintained the city as best he could, using his magic to repair structures damaged by the occasional earthquake or storm. He had kept Crystal Haven pristine, a perfect snapshot of a moment 300 years past, because to let it decay would have been to admit defeat, to acknowledge that his people were truly lost. The 3rd century, the one in which he now found himself in its twilight years, had brought something unexpected. Not hope, exactly, but a kind of renewed purpose. Iscaran had begun to notice changes in the world beyond his kingdom. The aurora lights that danced above Norvengard had started to pulse with patterns he had never seen before. The winds that swept across the tundra carried whispers of words and languages that had not existed when his kingdom fell. Most significantly, he had felt tremors in the fabric of the curse itself, tiny fluctuations that suggested something in the wider world was changing, shifting in ways that might finally affect the magic that held Norvengard in its grip. It was this realization that had drawn him from his throne today. For the first time in 300 years, Iscaran felt something he had thought lost forever, the possibility of change. He turned from the window and led his way through the silent palace, his footsteps echoing in halls that had known no other sound for centuries. He passed through corridors lined with portraits of his ancestors, rulers of Norvengard stretching back 1,000 years, each one wearing the same crown of ice and silver that now rested on Iscaran's head. He wondered what they would think of him, whether they would see his survival as strength or his inability to break the curse as weakness. The palace library was his destination, a vast circular room with shelves that spiraled up toward a domed ceiling, painted with a map of the stars as they had appeared on the night of Norvengard's founding. Iscaran had spent countless hours here, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of his people, books on magic and history, scrolls detailing ancient rituals, tablets carved with the words of the first winter mages. All of it had been consumed and studied and memorized until he could recite entire volumes from memory. But today he sought something specific. Deep in the library's heart, protected by wards only he could pass, stood a single pedestal made from black ice quarried from the deepest part of the northern ocean. Upon this pedestal rested a book bound in white leather, its pages made from something that was neither paper nor parchment, but rather seemed to be frozen light given solid form. This was the Codex of Endless Winter, the most sacred text of Norvengard, written by the kingdom's founder, Bormak I, more than a millennium ago. Iskeran had consulted the Codex countless times over the centuries, but always he had focused on the sections dealing with magic, with spells and counter curses. Now, prompted by some instinct he could not name, he opened the book to its final pages, sections he had largely ignored because they dealt not with magic, but with prophecy. Bormak had possessed the gift of foresight, and in his final years he had recorded visions of Norvengard's future, cryptic passages that spoke of trials and triumphs yet to come. The Ice King's fingers traced over words written in silver ink that shimmered even in the dim light of the library. Most of the prophecies he had read before and dismissed as either fulfilled or irrelevant, but one passage now caught his attention, a verse he had somehow overlooked in all his previous readings, or perhaps one that had not been visible until this moment. The ink seemed to glow brighter as his gaze fell upon it, and he read aloud, his voice the only sound in the silent library. When 3 centuries have turned, and the world beyond remembers not the crown of ice, when the guardian stands alone among his frozen children, and despair has worn the edges of his hope to nothing, then shall come the thaw. Not from within, but from without. Not through power, but through sacrifice. Not by magic, but by the one thing magic cannot touch. A heart unchanged by time. A love that refuses to forget. Iskeran read the passage 3 times, each word settling into his mind like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through his understanding. 3 centuries, the exact time that had passed, the world that had forgotten him. That much was certainly true. But the rest, this talk of thaw and sacrifice and unchanged hearts, what could it mean? He had sacrificed everything already. His kingdom, his family, his own existence beyond these frozen borders. What more could possibly be required? He closed the codex and stood in the silent library, feeling the weight of the prophecy settle over him, like a new burden added to the many he already carried. For 300 years, he had been reactive, trying to break a curse that had already been cast, attempting to undo what had been done. But prophecy suggested a different approach, not breaking the curse, but waiting for conditions to align, for the right moment when the magic might finally be vulnerable. The tremors he had felt in the curse, the changes in the aurora, the whispers on the wind, perhaps these were signs that the moment was approaching. Perhaps after 3 centuries of isolation, the world was finally ready to remember the Ice King of the North. But how would this remembering come? Who in the world beyond Norvengard even knew his kingdom had existed? The curse had not merely frozen his people in time, it had erased Norvengard from the memory of the world, removed it from maps and histories, caused those who had once known of the Northern Kingdom to forget it had ever been. Iskeran left the library and made his way to the highest tower of the palace, a journey that took him up a spiral staircase of 563 steps. He had counted them many times during his long isolation. At the top was an observatory, a room with walls of pure ice that allowed an unobstructed view of the lands in all directions. Here, he kept instruments that measured the flow of magic in the world, delicate constructs of crystal and silver that had been created by the greatest artificers of old Norvengard. The instruments were all active, their needles and dials moving in ways they had not moved for decades. The ley lines, the invisible rivers of magical energy that flowed through the world, were shifting. Something significant was happening beyond the borders of his frozen kingdom. Something that was affecting the very fabric of magic itself. Iskarin studied the readings, his mind working through possibilities. A great working of magic somewhere in the world? A natural phenomenon that affected the flow of energy? Or perhaps something related to the curse itself? Some external change that was weakening the bonds that held Norvengard outside of time? As he pondered these questions, movement in the distance caught his eye. Iskarin froze, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. There, at the very edge of his kingdom, where the frozen tundra met the slightly less frozen tundra that marked the border of Norvengard's curse, something was moving. For the first time in 300 years, something living had approached his kingdom. The Ice King pressed his face close to the wall, his breath forming patterns of frost on the already frozen surface. The figure was small, human-sized, wrapped in furs that marked them as a traveler from the south. He moved slowly, struggling against the wind and snow that was ever present at Norvengard's borders. As Iskarin watched, the figure stumbled, fell, rose again with evident difficulty. They were alone, which was strange. No one traveled the northern wastes alone, not if they valued their life. Yet here was someone doing exactly that, making their way directly toward the one place in the north that no one should have been able to find, that no one should have even remembered existed. A spark of something Iskarin had not felt in centuries flared in his chest. Excitement, perhaps, or fear, or some combination of both. He left the observatory at a run, descending the stairs 3 at a time, racing through the palace halls with a speed that belied his ancient nature. He had to reach the border, had to see who this impossible traveler was, had to understand why they had come. The prophecy's words echoed in his mind, not from within, but from without. The journey from the palace to the kingdom's border took Iskarin just under an hour, even moving at his fastest pace. He could have used his magic to transport himself instantly, but something made him want to make the journey on foot, to feel the reality of movement after so long sitting still. He passed through Crystal Haven, through streets where his frozen subjects stood eternal guard over shops and homes. He passed through the great gates of the city, massive constructs of iron and ice that had not been opened since the day the curse fell. He passed through the outlying villages, through farmlands where crops stood frozen in their fields, forever on the verge of harvest. Finally, he reached the border, marked by a line of standing stones that the first rulers of Norvengard had erected to define their territory. Beyond these stones, the world was muted, colors less vibrant, sounds less clear. This was the edge of the curse, the boundary between frozen time and the world that continued to turn. Iskarin could cross this boundary if he wished, could walk out into the wider world, but he never had. To leave Norvengard would have been to abandon his people. That was something he could never do. The traveller had collapsed just beyond the standing stones, their body a small, dark shape against the white snow. Iskarin could see their chest rising and falling. They were alive, but barely. Without thinking about the consequences, acting on an instinct that came from being a ruler who had once cared deeply for the welfare of others, Iskarin stepped across the boundary. The moment his foot touched the ground beyond the standing stones, he felt it, a rush of sensation, of time flowing around him, instead of standing still. It was disorienting after centuries of timelessness, like stepping from a quiet room into a roaring river. He reached the traveler in moments and knelt beside them, carefully turning them over. The furs fell away from their face, and Iskarin found himself looking at a young woman, perhaps 25 winters old, with dark hair that reminded him painfully of Alara. Her lips were blue with cold, her skin pale from exposure, but her eyes, when they fluttered open, were a warm brown that seemed to hold depths of determination. "The Ice King," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I found you. I remembered. Those words, I remembered," struck Iskarin with the force of a physical blow. The curse made people forget. That was part of its power, part of what made it unbreakable. Yet here was someone who had remembered, who had somehow retained knowledge of Norvengard and its ruler, who had travelled across the frozen north alone to find a kingdom that should not have existed in anyone's memory. "Who are you?" Iskarin asked, his own voice rough from centuries of speaking only to himself. "How do you know of me?" The woman's eyes closed again, and for a moment Iskarin feared she had slipped into unconsciousness, or worse. But then she spoke, each word an effort. "My name is Astrid, my grandmother. She was from Norvengard. She escaped the day before the curse fell. She carried the memory, passed it down, told me to find you, told me you were waiting." Astrid's words rearranged Iskarin's understanding of everything. Someone had escaped the curse, had carried the memory of Norvengard out into the world, had kept that memory alive through generations until it reached this woman who had undertaken an impossible journey to find him. The prophecy's words came back to him, a heart unchanged by time, a love that refuses to forget. He gathered Astrid into his arms, marveling at how light she was, how fragile compared to his own timeless existence. He carried her back across the boundary into Norvengard, and as he did, he felt something shift in the air around them. The curse, which had held absolute for 3 centuries, trembled. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Iskarin had spent so long studying the curse that he could feel every nuance of its structure. Bringing Astrid into Norvengard, bringing someone who remembered from the outside world, had created a crack in the magic, tiny but real. He took her to the palace, to his own chambers, where a fire burned that gave off no heat, but also required no fuel, one of the many paradoxes of his frozen kingdom. He laid her on his bed, the first person besides himself to occupy it in 300 years, and used his magic to slowly warm her, careful not to do it too quickly, lest the shock harm her. As colour returned to her face and her breathing steadied, Iskarin sat beside the bed and waited. It took several hours before Astrid fully woke. When she did, her eyes went wide as she took in her surroundings. The room of ice and silver, the magical fire, and most of all, Iskarin himself, the legendary Ice King made real. She sat up slowly, and Iskarin noticed she was stronger than he had expected, recovering with a resilience that spoke of determination and preparation. "I'm really here," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Norvengard. It's exactly as my grandmother described it. The Jewel of the North, she called it. She said it was the most beautiful place in the world." "Your grandmother," Iskarin said gently. "What was her name?" "Senna," Astrid replied. "She was a weaver in Crystalhaven. She had gone to visit her sister in the Southern Territories and was delayed by a storm. When she returned, she found nothing. At first, she thought she had lost her way, that she had somehow ended up in the wrong place, but she knew these lands too well for that. Norvengard had simply vanished. Iskeran remembered Senna, though the memory was distant. She had been young when he had last seen her. Just a girl, really, learning her craft from her mother. That she had escaped the curse by pure chance seemed almost too perfect, as if fate itself had been laying groundwork for this moment 3 centuries in advance. She tried to tell people, Astrid continued. She went to the southern kingdoms, to the historians and the map makers, and told them about Norvengard, but no one believed her. They said there was no kingdom in the north, that she must have dreamed it or invented it. The curse had done its work well, but Senna refused to forget. She married, had children, and she told them all about the homeland she had lost. Most of them thought she was mad, or that she was telling stories. But my mother believed her, and she told me, and I believed too. "Why did you come?" Iskeran asked. "What made you attempt such a dangerous journey?" Astrid's expression grew serious. "Because my grandmother's final words before she died were about Norvengard. She made me promise that I would find it, that I would find you. She said the curse could only be broken by someone from outside who remembered, and that 3 centuries would pass before the time was right. She said..." Astrid paused, as if unsure whether to continue. "Say it," Iskeran urged. "She said that you had been waiting alone all this time, that you had never stopped trying to save your people, and that you deserved to know someone still remembered, even if nothing could be done." The Ice King felt something crack inside himself, a different kind of breaking than the magical tremor in the curse. This was an emotional rupture. The wall he had built around his heart over centuries of isolation suddenly crumbling. Tears formed in his eyes, the first he had shed in 200 years, and they froze on his cheeks as they fell, tiny diamonds of ice that caught the light and sparkled. "I have waited," he said softly, "and I have tried everything, but I could never find the key to breaking the curse." Astrid reached out and took his hand, and Iskeran was shocked by the warmth of her touch, by the reminder of what living flesh felt like. "Show me your kingdom," she said. "Show me the people my grandmother loved, even if we cannot save them. Let me see what she remembered so clearly." And so Iskeran led Astrid through Norvengard, showing her crystal heaven in all its frozen glory, introducing her to his subjects who stood like statues throughout the city. He showed her the marketplace where her grandmother would have worked, the weaver's district with its looms still threaded with half-finished tapestries. He showed her the palace gardens where ice flowers bloomed eternal, never wilting, never growing, caught forever in their peak beauty. He showed her his family, Ilara and Freya, still standing on the balcony where they had been when the curse fell, and Astrid wept for them, tears that marked the first real grieving Iskeran had witnessed for his lost kingdom in all the long centuries. As they walked and talked, Iskeran felt the curse continue to tremble. Each hour Astrid spent in Norvengard, each memory she shared of what her grandmother had told her, each moment she existed as a living link between the frozen kingdom and the world that had forgotten it, weakened the magic that held them. By the time they returned to the palace, Iskeran could feel it clearly. The curse was failing. "It's you," he said to Astrid as they stood in the throne room. "You are the key." The prophecy spoke of a heart unchanged by time, a love that refuses to forget. Your grandmother loved Norvengard so much that she kept its memory alive for 3 centuries, passing that love down through her family until it reached you. That's what the curse cannot withstand. Not power, not magic, but memory preserved through generations. Love that refuses to die. Astrid looked around the throne room with new understanding. Then what do we do? How do we finish breaking the curse? Iskerin walked to his throne and removed the crown from his head, the crown of ice and silver that had marked him as king for 3 centuries. He held it out to Astrid. The curse was designed to isolate Norvengard, to make the world forget. But you remembered. You came. You brought the outside world back to us. Now, we need to do the same in reverse. We need to bring Norvengard back to the world. He placed the crown in her hands. Take this beyond the border. Return to your home, to your people. Show them this crown. Tell them the story of Norvengard. Make them remember. When enough people in the outside world hold the memory of this kingdom in their hearts, when we exist in the collective consciousness of the world again, the curse will have no power. We will snap back into time, back into the world, as if we had never left. Astrid held the crown, feeling its weight, understanding the magnitude of what he was asking. But that could take years, decades. How will you survive that much longer alone? I have already survived 3 centuries, Iskerin said with a sad smile. I can endure whatever time is necessary. Besides, I won't be truly alone anymore. Now I know someone remembers, someone cares. That changes everything. But Astrid shook her head. There has to be another way. The prophecy spoke of sacrifice. What if... She paused, thinking. What if the sacrifice is mine to make, not yours? You've already sacrificed everything. Maybe it's time someone sacrificed something for you. Before Iskerin could ask what she meant, Astrid closed her eyes and clasped the crown tightly. She began to speak in a language Iskerin didn't recognize at first, but then he realized it was Old Norvengardian, the ancient dialect that predated even Vormak I. His eyes widened as he understood. Senna had taught her family not just memories of Norvengard, but its language, its magic, its very essence. Astrid was working a spell, one that Iskerin quickly recognized as incredibly dangerous. She was offering herself as a bridge, using her life force to connect Norvengard to the outside world, to pull the kingdom back into the flow of time, by anchoring it to her own timeline. It was brilliant and terrible. It would work, but the strain might kill her. "Stop!" Iskerin commanded, rushing forward. "You'll die!" "I'm willing to risk it," Astrid said. Her voice strained as power built around her. My grandmother spent her whole life mourning what she had lost. She passed that grief down to my mother, to me. Let me turn that grief into something good. Let me be the one who brings Norvengard home. The magic swirled around them both now, visible as streams of light that flowed between Astrid and the very walls of the throne room. Iskerin could feel the curse shattering, breaking apart under the assault of this impossible spell, but he could also feel Astrid weakening, her life force being consumed by the working. Without thinking, acting on instinct and 3 centuries of mastered magic, Iskerin joined his power to hers. The Ice King reached out and took Astrid's hands, the crown held between their joined palms. He poured his own magic into the spell, adding his strength to hers, sharing the burden she had tried to take on alone. Together, their combined power surged through Norvengard, touching every frozen citizen, every stopped moment, every suspended second of the last 300 years. The curse broke with a sound like the world's largest mirror shattering. Time rushed back into Norvengard like a flood, and suddenly everything was moving again. In the marketplace, merchants completed sales that had been frozen mid-transaction. In homes throughout Crystal Haven, families finished conversations that had been interrupted 3 centuries ago. On the palace balcony, Elara and Freya gasped as time resumed, finding themselves looking at a city unchanged yet somehow different. And in the throne room, Iskaran and Astrid collapsed together, the spell complete, the curse broken, the cost paid. The Ice King looked up at the ceiling of his throne room and saw, for the first time in 300 years, dust motes floating in the air, tiny particles that moved and drifted, because time was flowing again, because change was possible again, because his kingdom had returned to the world. Beside him, Astrid breathed heavily but smiled. "We did it," she whispered. "Your people are free." Iskaran took her hand and helped her to her feet. Outside, he could hear sounds he had not heard in centuries. Voices raised in confusion and wonder. Footsteps as people moved through the streets. The living sounds of the kingdom restored. He looked at Astrid, this impossible woman who had traveled across the world to remember what everyone else had forgotten, and he knew that whatever came next, Norvengard would face it, not alone, but as part of the world again, connected, remembered, and finally free. The forgotten Ice King of the North was forgotten no more. The King and the Infinite Library. King Eldric III had ruled the kingdom of Valmir for 27 years when he first heard whispers of the Infinite Library. The rumors came from a merchant who traveled from lands beyond the eastern mountains, speaking of a place where every book ever written, and every book that could ever be written, existed in endless corridors of knowledge. The merchant claimed it appeared only to those who sought answers they could find nowhere else. Aldrich had everything a king could want: a prosperous realm, loyal subjects, 3 healthy children, and a wife who still made him laugh after 31 years of marriage. Yet something gnawed at him during sleepless nights in his 54th year of life. He'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives, and lately he'd begun to wonder, had he made the right choices? The execution he'd ordered in the year 1473, the treaty he'd refused in 1480, the war he'd waged when he was only 29 years old. "You can't undo the past, my love," Queen Isadora told him one evening, as they walked through the palace gardens. The roses were blooming late that year, their red petals catching the golden light of the setting sun. "I know," Aldrich replied, pausing by the fountain where they'd first kissed 4 decades earlier. "But I wonder if I could at least understand it better. Understand whether another path might have led to less suffering." 3 nights later, unable to sleep, Aldrich rose from his bed and dressed in simple traveling clothes. He left a note for Isadora. She'd be furious, but she'd understand, and slipped out through a servant's passage he'd discovered as a boy of 12. The palace had been built in the year 1328, and its secret corridors had witnessed the comings and goings of 6 generations of monarchs. The merchant had said the library appeared in places of transition, where one thing ended and another began. Aldrich rode his horse to the border of his kingdom, where Valmir met the unclaimed wildlands. Dawn was still 2 hours away, and the darkness seemed absolute beneath the canopy of ancient oaks. He dismounted and walked forward, leading his horse by the reins. The boundary marker, a stone pillar erected 700 years ago, rose from the earth like a finger pointing at the stars. Aldrich had been here only once before, as a young prince of 17, testing his courage against the unknown. "I seek the infinite library," he said aloud, feeling foolish. "I have questions that need answering." The forest remained silent. Minutes passed. His horse nickeled nervously, ears swiveling toward sounds Aldrich couldn't hear. Then, gradually, he noticed something impossible. Light was emanating from between 2 particularly massive oak trees, though sunrise was still far off. The light was warm and golden, like candlelight multiplied by 10,000 flames. Aldrich tied his horse to a low branch and approached the light. As he stepped between the oaks, the forest disappeared. He stood instead in an entrance hall so vast that its ceiling vanished into shadow high above. Shelves stretched in every direction, each one filled with books of every size and color imaginable. The air smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and something else, something like possibility itself. "Welcome, King Aldrich III of Valmir," a voice said. Aldrich spun around to find a figure standing beside him. Or rather, what appeared to be a figure. It shifted constantly, sometimes appearing as a wizened old woman, sometimes as a young man, sometimes as something neither human nor quite anything else. "I am the keeper. You may ask the library one question." "Only one?" Aldrich's heart sank. He had so many questions. "The library is infinite," the keeper said, "but mortal minds are not. One question is all you can carry back with you. Choose wisely." Aldrich thought of all the decisions that haunted him. The rebellious lord he'd executed when he was 26. The famine during the harsh winter of 1468, when he'd had to choose which provinces received aid first. The daughter he'd betrothed to a foreign prince when she was only 15, securing peace but breaking her heart. "I want to know," he said slowly, "if I made the right choice when I executed Lord Brennan for treason in the year 1473. The keeper's form solidified into something almost human, an old librarian with spectacles perched on a long nose. "Follow me." They walked through corridors of books that seemed to reshape themselves as they passed. Aldrich glimpsed titles in languages he recognized, and dozens he didn't. Some books were massive tomes that would require 3 men to lift. Others were tiny volumes no larger than his thumb. Some glowed with inner light. Others seemed to absorb the illumination around them, leaving pools of shadow on their shelves. After what felt like both moments and hours, the keeper stopped before a shelf and pulled out a leather-bound volume of moderate size. The cover bore no title, only a date embossed in gold, 1473. "This book contains the story of what happened," the keeper said, "and what would have happened had you chosen differently." Aldrich opened the book with trembling hands. The pages were crisp and clean, the text written in elegant script that seemed to rearrange itself into his native language as he looked at it. He began to read. Lord Brennan had indeed plotted against him. That much was true. The evidence Aldrich's spy master had presented was genuine. Letters discussing the overthrow of the crown, meetings with foreign agents, plans to assassinate the king during the Festival of Harvests. Aldrich had agonized over the decision for 3 sleepless nights before ordering Brennan's execution. The man had been his childhood friend, someone who'd fought beside him in the Northern Wars, someone whose children played with his own. The book showed him what he'd known and what he hadn't. Brennan's eldest son, Thomas, had watched his father die on the executioner's block. The boy had been 14. The book showed Thomas growing up with rage carved into his heart like words into stone. At 21, Thomas led a small rebellion that killed 47 soldiers before being crushed. At 23, he was captured and executed, just as his father had been. But there was more. Brennan's younger children were absorbed into other noble families, raised with the stain of their father's treason marking them forever. His daughter, Catherine, became a skilled healer, saving countless lives during the plague of 1491. But she never married, never allowed herself happiness, carrying guilt for a crime she hadn't committed. Aldrich's hands shook as he turned the pages. Then he reached the section titled The Alternate. In this version, Aldrich had exiled Lord Brennan instead of executing him. The traitor was sent across the Eastern Sea with enough gold to live modestly, but forbidden from ever returning to Valmere. Thomas grew up bitter, but not consumed by vengeance. He became a merchant in the distant city of Calspar, married a weaver's daughter, had 4 children. Catherine married a carpenter and lived a quiet, happy life, her healing skills unknown to history. But the alternate history showed other changes too. Without Brennan's execution as an example, 3 other lords grew bolder in their treasonous ambitions. A coup attempt came in 1479, resulting in a civil war that killed thousands. The kingdom was fractured for 7 years. Famine spread as farms were burned and trade routes destroyed. Aldrich's own son Edmund was killed in battle at age 19. The version where Aldrich showed mercy to one man led to catastrophe for many. The version where he ordered an execution, despite the personal pain, despite losing a friend, maintained peace and stability for decades. But Thomas, Aldrich whispered, that boy made his own choices, the keeper said gently. His pain was real, shaped by your decision. But pain exists in all timelines, Your Majesty. The question isn't whether suffering exists. It always does. The question is whether the choices you made minimized unnecessary harm while upholding necessary principles. Aldrich closed the book, and immediately its contents began to fade from his mind like morning mist, leaving only impressions and feelings. He could no longer recall the specific details, but he remembered the essence. His decision had been terrible and tragic, and also necessary. There had been no good choice, only the least destructive one. This is what you came to learn? The keeper asked. I don't know, Aldrich admitted. His chest felt both heavier and lighter somehow. I thought I wanted certainty. I wanted to know I'd done the right thing. But there was no right thing, was there? Just the choice I made with the information I had, trying my best. Kings rarely have the luxury of good options, the keeper agreed. Only consequential ones. They walked back through the corridors of infinite books. Aldrich glimpsed countless other volumes he longed to read. Books about his other decisions, surely. but also books about everything else imaginable. Aldrich paused before a shelf where a slim volume caught his eye. The cover was deep blue, like the ocean on a clear day, and it bore a title in silver letters: The King Who Read Too Much. He reached for it, but the keeper's hand, suddenly solid and surprisingly strong, caught his wrist. "Your question has been answered," the keeper said. "Each visitor is permitted only one question. To read more would be to exceed the capacity of your mortal mind to hold knowledge without being destroyed by it." "But there's so much I want to know," Aldrich protested, even as he lowered his hand. "The treaty with Castanerai, refused in 1480. Was that the right choice? The religious reforms I implemented when I was 33, the tax on grain I levied during—" "Stop," the keeper interrupted, and though the voice wasn't loud, it carried the weight of avalanches and tidal waves. "Do you truly want to know all of this? To see every path not taken, every consequence of every choice? To carry the weight of infinite might-have-beens?" Aldrich opened his mouth to say yes, then slowly closed it. He thought about the book he'd just read, how even now its specific details were fading, leaving only impressions. The human mind wasn't built to hold perfect knowledge of even one decision's full ramifications, let alone dozens or hundreds. "There was a king once," the keeper said, and they resumed walking toward the entrance hall, "who came to this library 500 years ago. He asked his question and received his answer, just as you did. But as he was leaving, he grew convinced he needed more knowledge. He broke free from my guidance and ran into the stacks, pulling down volume after volume, reading frantically. What happened to him?" "He's still here," the keeper said. "Read it. He's been reading for 5 centuries, and he will read for 5 more, and 5 after that, forever. He knows everything now, every possible outcome of every possible choice made by every possible person. The weight of that knowledge has crushed his mind into something that can no longer be called human. He understands everything and nothing. He exists in all timelines and none." They reached the entrance hall, where moonlight from the outside world created a rectangle of silver light between the oak trees. Aldrich's horse waited patiently beyond. "Before you go," the keeper said, "I offer you something freely, not in answer to your question, a truth that every visitor to the Infinite Library must eventually understand." Aldrich turned to face the shifting figure. "What truth?" "That certainty is a cage," the keeper said. "You came here seeking to know if you'd made the right choice, but right and wrong are not absolutes in the way mortals hope they are. You are a king, which means you make choices that affect thousands of lives. Some of those people will suffer because of your decisions. Others will thrive. Some would have suffered more under different decisions. Others would have thrived more. There is no timeline where everyone is happy. No choice that leads to universal good." "Then how am I supposed to rule?" Aldrich asked, feeling suddenly very young despite his 54 years. "How do I make these impossible choices?" "The way you've been doing," the keeper replied, "with the information available to you, with careful thought, with advisors you trust, with principles you hold dear, and then, having made your choice, you live with it. You accept that you are fallible, that you cannot know everything, that you will sometimes be wrong, and you continue forward, doing your best." "That doesn't feel like enough," Aldrich said quietly. "It never does," the keeper agreed, but it's all any mortal can do. Even kings, especially kings. Aldrich looked back into the vast library one last time. Somewhere in those infinite corridors was a book about every moment of his life, every decision he would ever make, every possible version of himself that might exist in other timelines. The temptation to stay, to read, to know everything was almost overwhelming. The king who stayed, Aldrich said, the one who's been reading for 500 years. What was his name? He doesn't remember anymore, the keeper said sadly. That's part of what was lost. Aldrich walked toward the moonlight. As he stepped between the oak trees, the library vanished behind him as if it had never existed. His horse greeted him with a soft whinny. The forest was alive with the sounds of early morning. Birds beginning their dawn chorus, small creatures rustling in the undergrowth, wind whispering through leaves. He rode home slowly, arriving at the palace just as the sun breached the eastern horizon. The guards at the gate startled to see their king returning alone, dressed in traveling clothes, but they knew better than to question him. Word spread quickly through the palace, and by the time Aldrich reached his chambers, Isidora was waiting for him, her face a mixture of relief and fury. "You could have been killed," she said, embracing him tightly despite her anger. Riding out alone in the middle of the night like a foolish boy of 16 instead of a king of 54 years. "I had to," Aldrich said simply, holding her close. "I had questions that needed answering." "And did you find your answers?" Aldrich thought about the book he'd read, its details already almost completely faded from his memory. He could no longer recall the specific events it had described, but he remembered the feeling, that terrible, necessary weight of leadership. He remembered understanding that there had been no good choice, only the choice he'd made. "Yes," he said, "and no. I learned that I'll never really know if I've made the right choices. I can only make the best choices I can with what I know at the time." Isidora pulled back to look at him, studying his face. "You traveled somewhere strange to learn something you already knew." "I knew it," Aldrich admitted, "but I didn't believe it. Not really. I kept thinking there must be a way to know for certain, to have proof that I'd done the right thing. And now? Now I understand that certainty is impossible, and that's terrifying, but also somehow freeing." Over the following weeks, Aldrich found himself making decisions differently. Not radically so. He still consulted his advisors, still weighed options carefully, still agonized over difficult choices. But when he finally made a decision, he accepted it rather than torturing himself with endless second-guessing. He'd done his best with the information available. That had to be enough. When a dispute arose between two noble families over land rights, he made his judgment and moved forward, accepting that one family would be unhappy, rather than trying to find a perfect solution that would satisfy everyone. When the harvest fell short, and he had to decide how to distribute grain from the royal stores, he made his choice knowing that some would suffer more than others, but that delay would make everyone suffer more. He was more present with his children, less consumed by regret over past decisions. He laughed more with Isidora. He slept better at night. Years passed. Aldrich grew older, his hair turning from grey to white, his joints stiffening, his memory becoming unreliable in small ways. He never spoke of the infinite library to anyone except Isidora, and even with her, he said little. What was there to say? that he'd found a magical place and learned he was fallible? She'd always known that. When Aldrich was 71 years old and lying in bed with a fever his physicians couldn't cure, Isidora sat beside him holding his hand. Their eldest son, Edmund, named for Aldrich's father, would be crowned king within days or weeks. The kingdom was prosperous and at peace. Not perfect, never perfect, but stable and hopeful. "Do you have regrets?" Isidora asked him softly. Aldrich thought about his life, his reign, his choices. Of course, he had regrets. Lord Brennan's execution still haunted him on dark nights, though he'd long since made peace with the necessity of it. He regretted the harshness of some of his early judgments when he'd been young and trying to prove his strength. He regretted missing his daughter's 12th birthday because of a diplomatic crisis he now couldn't even remember. "Many," he said honestly, "but I also know I made the best choices I could at the time. I can't ask more of myself than that." "You were a good king," Isidora said, tears streaming down her face. "A good man." "I tried to be," Aldrich replied. "That's all any of us can do. Try our best and accept our limits." He died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep, having ruled Valmere for 44 years. The kingdom mourned him, and historians would later call his reign the Golden Peace, a time of stability between eras of strife. But Aldrich would have laughed at that title. He knew the truth, that there had been plenty of strife during his reign, plenty of hard choices and impossible decisions, and people who suffered because of things he did or failed to do. But he'd also learned in an infinite library on the border between his kingdom and the wildlands that perfect knowledge was a curse and certainty was an illusion. He'd learned to make peace with his own fallibility, to accept that leadership meant carrying the weight of consequential choices without ever being certain they were right. And somehow, paradoxically, that acceptance had made him a better king than the desperate quest for certainty ever could have. In the infinite library, a new book appeared on a shelf in a distant corridor. Its cover was simple leather, its title embossed in gold: King Aldrich III of Valmere. Inside its pages were all the choices he'd made, all the timelines he'd created, all the lives he'd touched for better and worse. The keeper, in one of its infinite forms, shelved the book carefully among countless others, the stories of kings and peasants, heroes and villains, all the souls who'd ever lived or would ever live. And in a clearing between 2 ancient oaks, where a stone marker had stood for over 700 years, the boundary between kingdoms remained unchanged. Occasionally, a traveler would pause there and sense something, a whisper of possibility, a hint of light that shouldn't exist, a feeling that if they spoke their deepest question aloud, someone might answer. But most people simply passed through without noticing, continuing their journeys, making their choices, living their lives without certainty but with hope, which had always been enough.